To me, Conan was Robert E. Howard at his best. His great character, and one of the great heroes of American popular literature.
I think screenwriting is very similar to writing comics. I mean, both are visual medium, and you'll find, especially today, that there's a lot of crossbreeding between comic book writers and artists and who are writing film and film writers who are writing comics.
Well, working with Stan Lee was probably the greatest experience of my life. I had worked for the competition, DC Comics, for 2 weeks. I met Stan on my lunch hour because he had me take a little writing test, and 10 minutes later he offered me a job. Half hour later I was back at DC and quit. I wanted to work for DC Comics for all these years, and I went to work for Stan for like 15. And we just had a wonderful experience. I would be there every morning on his right or left hand, and he would go over what he had written the day before on Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or Thor and show why he did what he did and where to place the balloons. I mean, all these things I'd never thought about as a comics fan. Where do you put the balloons? How much dialogue can you get in a balloon? Why do you avoid certain words, maybe because letters will close up and they'll look like dirty words. All sorts of strange things I never thought about. And it was just a real education. I was the one who had been the high school teacher for several years, but I never liked that. Stan was just a great teacher. And sometimes that would bear down a little heavy when it was on my work, but it was a wonderful experience. When I got the rights for Marvel to do Conan, we didn't have the right to adapt any stories. We just had the rights to use the character. It was deemed to be too complicated to get the rights to also adapt actual stories. I wasn't going to be happy until I got to adapt all these wonderful stories that I had read that I really loved. So I very quickly worked out with the literary agent for the estate, Glenn Lord, to be able to pay a little extra. We ended up being able to adapt all the great stories, starting with the very fourth issue, which was Tower of the Elephant, one of the very best stories. And a little later, we were able to get the rights to the other writers, such as L. Sprague de Camp, who had written a lot of Conan stories. And eventually, we were able to adapt almost, by the time I left in 1980, we had adapted almost everything that anybody had ever written about Conan in prose up to that point. Stan had set the style for the Marvel writing, starting in the early 60s. And it was heavy on a lot of thought balloons. Spider-Man was always thinking about, am I going to be able to get a date? Am I going to be able to pay for this or that? And all this teen angst and so forth that Marvel became known for. And also for great big gaudy sound effects, splang and patang, and Stan was great at inventing sound effects. When I started doing Conan about 5 years after I was working there, I decided I wanted to do something a little different from the usual Marvel comic. I just wanted it to have its own identity, so I omitted the thought balloons, because in Howard's stories, you never really got inside Conan's mind. It never told you exactly what he was thinking. So I decided I'd have captions that would give a little of that, but I would not have any thought balloons, and I would not have any non-verbal sound effect. If somebody screeches, ee, that's okay, or a growl, but no non-verbals. And I'd been doing that for about a year or so, and then I had a story come in, and Stan looked at it and said, well, this would be really good if it had a big splang right here where these two swords are hitting. And I told him, I don't do non-verbal sound effects in the Conan comics, and he just stared at me in horror, because that was part of his style. But he figured, well, by that time the books were doing pretty well, so he said, well, I guess you're onto something, so he let it go. And so I think there was one click that got in that somebody else put in once, but in all the thousands of pages I wrote, there was never a real sound effect or a thought balloon in Conan. And I thought that was kind of an interesting little experiment, very unusual for the time. Ed Pressman was interested in producing a Conan movie back in the middle 70s, 75 I guess it was. And a friend and associate of his, Ed Summer, who ran a comic book store and art emporium in New York, was also a friend of mine. And he came to me one day and said that Ed Pressman would love to get in touch with some of the people who controlled Conan, and I explained to him, well, they weren't speaking to each other. There were feuds, and that's been a problem. So I introduced him to the literary agent, and pretty soon they all got together on this Conan Properties Incorporated, and it was putting all these various people together into one group that made the Conan movie possible, even though it took another, 6 or 7 years before the movie actually got made. And the reason the comics were so important at that time was because the books were not coming out. The Conan books had come out from the middle 60s through the very late 60s from Lancer Books, but Lancer had gone into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So for a period of several years in the late 70s and so forth through the early 80s, the Conan stories were not available in prose form. So people only knew Conan through the comics, but luckily we're selling, you know, 250,000 or so every month of Conan, and then we had the black and white book by the middle 70s, and that was a big item. So that made, that as much as anything helped make the movie possible, even though, of course, the authentic Conan was always Robert E. Howard. Ed Pressman had paid me for the work on the Conan the Barbarian movie as story consultant, and that was fine with me. And I couldn't write another sword and sorcery movie for about 1 year, but nobody was asking me to anyway, so I figured, what the heck, I'll take 10 years of that. And so in the meantime, the first movie came out, and it was nice, and it did very well. And then one day, I get a call from Ed, and whom I got along with very well, but I hadn't heard from him for many months, and he's asking me, well, what are you doing these days? I said, well, my partner Jerry Conway and I, we just wrote an animated sword and sorcery film for Ralph Bakshi called Fire and Ice, and we sold a couple of other movies. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. He says, we're about to start working on the second Conan movie, and I've got a young Australian, New Zealand director, Roger Donaldson, to do it. And he said, you should come in, you and your partner should come in, and we should talk about maybe you writing it, and because you've got this experience now, and and so forth. And I said, well, that's great, but I know that this is not what Ed called about, because he didn't know this. So I keep thinking, what is it he called about? I didn't get a lot of calls from producers, ordinarily. So just at a certain point, there comes this thing I call the Columbo moment, when it sounds like the conversation's over, and then Ed says, oh, by the way, like Columbo pausing at the door. He says, by the way, he says, you remember that I paid you for being the story consultant on Conan the Barbarian? And I'm thinking, oh boy, he's going to do it again for the second movie, and that's great. And he says, well, Dino De Laurentiis is now sort of in as, co-producing the second movie in a bigger way than the first. And he says, and he's supposed to pay me back all the expenses that I paid out for the first movie. And he's written me a check, but it's made out to you. So then I see the reason for the call. He needs me to sign the check over to him so he can cash it. And I said, sure, send somebody over. Maybe it took 10 minutes for somebody to get there. I said, I'll sign it. I got my money. I had no problem. But because of this accident of his needing me to sign the check, he found out that we had some movie credits, and as a result, writing the first several drafts of the second Conan movie. And it was just one of these weird accidents that I kind of lucked into.
Our goal when we came onto this was to do the Conan of the books and of the comics, which we didn't really feel had been accomplished in the first film. Roy and I discovered that it worked really well for me to write the first scene and get to the point where I was burning out. Then he would take over, and then he would continue writing until the point that he was burning out. And I would be rejuvenated by that point and come back in. And so we just basically tag-teamed the script.
Mm-hmm. The movie contained a lot of things that were taken either from Howard's original stories or from the comic books. The most noticeable, Zula. A few years earlier, when I was writing Conan, I had wanted to make up a black hero. I felt there should be a black hero who was sort of like a Conan type. I gave him sort of vaguely hypnotic magical powers to make him sort of sword and sorcerer in one person. I was combining Mandrake the magician and his assistant Lothar into one character is what it really was. And I named the character Zula because the A ending in a lot of African language is masculine rather than feminine in English. So I thought Zula was a nice name, kind of typical comic booky name taken from Zulu. We wanted somebody different from the blonde Valeria in the first movie, so we thought a black Amazon warrior type would be very good. And we just stuck the name Zula on because it had been in the comics and it sounded kind of feminine, even though in the comics it had been a man. And it was supposed to be just a holding name, until we thought of something better. And people kind of began to like Zula, so we just ended up keeping it. So there are two Zulas. In the comic book, there's the man, and in the movie, there's the woman.
And as we were discussing between ourselves earlier, the casting of Grace Jones was something that I can't say that we were directly responsible for, but we came up with the idea of using someone like Grace Jones.
A lot of the scenes in the movie look like the scenes we wrote, and so forth. They're, they're not the same, but they're similar or they're based on them or whatever. But one scene that Richard Fleischer and Stanley Mann, between them, added totally was the introduction of Zula, in which you see her surrounded by an angry army of villagers, and she's tethered by one leg, and she's having to hold them off before he rescues her. And that was entirely their invention. Valeria was the love interest in the first movie, although she's only named in the credits. Somehow the name never quite made it into the movie as it got edited. But she was killed. So one of the comics I had done, in fact, the very last color Conan I had done, 10 years anniversary issue, had a sorcerer promising to bring his lady love, who wasn't Valeria but was the same kind of character, to life if he would do this, rather unpleasant task for him. And Conan was very tempted to do it. And at the end, he decides he can't do it. It just isn't right to do. So he forgoes the chance of bringing his beloved back to life and so forth. And near the end of as Jerry and I were working on the fourth draft, or really the fifth draft of the film, and Richard Fleischer was the director coming in, I remember telling Richard, I said, about this element, which they didn't want me to do originally, but I thought, gee, maybe it was time to add that back in. And he really sparked to the idea, so I loaned him a copy of that comic book, and that ended up making its way into the movie and gave it a little bit of an extra motivation for Conan and a tie-in with the first movie, which I rather liked. In other cases, we had to leave things out. For example, we had wanted to have, in particular, I wanted to have that giant spider. It was supposed to be a spider the size of a pig. It was described by Howard in the story The Tower of the Elephant. And we had that all ready to go in the movie when we were working on it, and we had a meeting with an executive on another project at another studio, and he started to tell us about this sword and sorcery science fiction movie they were making, called Crawl, and it had a crystal spider in it, a giant crystal spider. So there went that idea, because it would just look like we were copying the other movie if it came out first. So we started thinking about what are we going to do instead of the spider. So we made up this idea of leeches. I guess the African Queen with Humphrey Bogart was part of the inspiration.
Conan was going to swim through a sewer that went under the tower, come up through a grating into a subterranean vault that had these holes in the wall that start off as little tiny holes where you see little tiny leeches. And then as you climb up the vault, the holes start getting bigger and the leeches get bigger until you're up near the very top of the vault and there's this giant hole. The big moment of this film, and it survived through every single draft and all the changes that we incorporated for Dino until
the end.
One of the recurring story points that we had was this battle of the gods, and one of the bad gods was going to be this god Dagoth that was
tus tráilers, visita mi canal.
The evil god.
He was the devil.
He was the devil.
Yeah.
And we wanted to have him have wings and fly, and we're going to have a big battle on top of a cliff and all of this. I think some of that is survived in the comic book version.
All of it survived in the comic book version.
Yeah, well, it was sort of the alternate movie version. And we were going to have this spectacular fight where in midair with Conan having to hack away at this giant bat-like creature. And again, as I say, financially, this would have been enormous. I mean, because we didn't have digital effects back then. And Dino, rightly, probably given the fact that opticals at that point were fairly crude, did not want to have any optical effects in the film if he could avoid it. So I guess we knew going along, as we were progressing along, that a lot of our bigger moments weren't going to survive. But most of the process of doing the 5 drafts was in whittling down the original visuals, to something that was more doable as a feature.
The music has to sing its way through the film and remind the audience constantly that this is a mythology which has existed. John Milius had very strong ideas about the music for Conan the Barbarian. He knew that he had so little dialogue in the film that he wanted it to play as an opera does. When we were recording the first one, I remember there's a thing in music called the major third. It's what makes a chord either major or minor, happy, sad. I mean, it's that kind of association. It's just the difference between a half step, half tone in music. And every time I would strike this major third, Milius was standing in the booth and I was conducting, and he would do this gigantic cross, and he'd hit it and bang on the window. And I had no idea what the hell he was talking about, I thought it was time out. I couldn't, so I went in and I said, so what's with the cross? He goes, it's too Christian. And so by understanding that to his ear, this interval, which is, it's in everything we're used to. It's not an extraordinary interval at all. It's just very sophisticated in the development of musical history. And to his way of thinking, that there should be none of these things, at least in the main title. While we were in cinema school, I had written a piece of music that John quite never forgot. And he was convinced that it would be ideal if it were changed somewhat to represent the power, the strength, and the kind of energy that Conan the character should have. And I think that it was basically his remembering this thing that I had written when we were in college and performed on the piano. His using that as a starting point, that he wanted the rest of the score to have that kind of feel. And I think the thing that probably excited him about it was that it was very primitive. He knew that he wanted the music, like the film, to almost have a prehistoric quality to it. We had spoken about the way Miklos Rozsa created the musical soundscapes for Rome, for ancient Rome, in a lot of the films of the 50s. And we were both in agreement that that was way too modern for what Conan was supposed to be. So it was a combination of that. I think also the work that I had done for him on Big Wednesday. It was clear that he and I saw ultimately the same kind of vision of the film. I think if you look through a lot of various composers, and you'll see strong relationships with directors. And I'm certainly not conversant with any of them in terms of that. But you need to look no further than the association of John Williams and Steven Spielberg, and John Williams and George Lucas, Robert Zemeckis and Alan Silvestri, Danny Elfman and Tim Burton. I mean, I think that there are some very standout kinds of relationships that have worked really well throughout the last 15, 20 years, and I think that the directors involve these composers very heavily in their work. I'm not sure of that, but I would guess that's the way it works, particularly if there's pre-record material, if there's material that the composer needs to come up with while the film is in production, dance numbers, this sort of thing. So there are various reasons to involve a composer, but I think probably the best reason would be because the director is interested in getting the composer in and becoming part of his or her vision as soon as possible. I studied to be a concert pianist, so my main performing instrument, I suppose, would be keyboards now. Originally it was piano, but now with the inclusion of synthesizers and most of the electronic controllers are keyboard-oriented, the work that we use for our computers. So that is my main instrument. The time constraints on writing a film have shrunk. When I first started out, 12 weeks was not an unusual amount of time for a composer to be given to write a film score. And basically it broke down that the first 4 weeks were coming up with thematic material, working with the director, working with the music editors or the people that actually break down the timings of the films and the various scenes, and with the director and the composer map out how the score is going to go. And then the other 8 weeks were basically taken writing the score. These things have been cut down to anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks of actual writing and gestation, coming up with the themes themselves. So it's necessitated the inclusion of the orchestrator, and basically that's a person again,
Y tus
throughout
trailers,
Hollywood, they're used
visita mi canal.
variously in various different ways. I would write out sketches anywhere from 4 lines to 12 lines, depending on how complex the music needed to be in terms of the numbers of instruments performing it. The orchestrator then would take the sketch and literally, in a sketch, I might have one note that could represent 6 instruments, and then actually has to write a line of music for each individual instrument. So they take the sketch and blow it up to a full orchestration. And that relationship, I think, is key. It's absolutely key. As much as a composer is, must understand the vision of the director, the orchestrator must understand the vision of the composer. And it goes beyond, yes, I mean, you can become very specific and anybody could take a sketch. But I've always enjoyed working with orchestrators that I think know a little bit more about me. And if there's a chance for magic to get into the process, then I believe in that happening. A few years after I did Conan the Barbarian, then of course the sequel of Conan the Destroyer was on the boards and came out. Raffaella De Laurentiis, who produced the first Conan along with Buzz Feitshans, called and said that she would, was I interested in scoring Conan the Destroyer? Well, and I said, well, of course, because I figured, well, this is going to be a walk. I've already done all the music for the first one. The orchestrations were complete, so it's just a matter of, tearing the score pages out of the first one, throwing them into the second. We'll go to Rome and record, and that'll be it. That was a very naive and fallacious assumption, I have to tell you, because after meeting with Richard Fleischer and Raffaella, I realized they had a much different film on their hands. Now, I didn't see the film until after they had come back from shooting, and I think Frank Uriosti was the editor, if I'm not mistaken. And upon viewing the film, I realized that yes, there were certainly sections that cried for the use and the inclusion of some of the original material from Conan the Barbarian, but this was a whole different animal. This was an entirely different attitude. It was more. There was more of a lighthearted nature to it. It was more less concerned about revenge. In fact, there was very little revenge in it. So there were many main considerations that we had put into the first one that really were totally inappropriate for Conan the Destroyer. That's when the work began. So it just kind of grew from the original one. It was almost taking the original one and deconstructing it to making it fit. Because in a true sense, it really wasn't a sequel. It didn't pick up where Conan the Barbarian stopped. It kind of assumed that Conan had gone on and become a little more sophisticated, a little more worldly, learned language a little better, and the usage of it, and his ability to communicate with the outside world, instead of just looking for Thulsa Doom, wanting to, kill him. I don't think there's a composer alive who wouldn't embrace the opportunity to go back and change something. I really seriously doubt, if anybody would not welcome that chance. Aside from the amount of work it would take and throwing yourself back into a reality that you might not have been too fond of at the time you were doing it. But nonetheless, sequels offer that opportunity. The main title of Conan itself, which then was later used in of course, Conan the Destroyer, came about from discussions with John. He wanted it to be rhythmic. He wanted it to be rhythmically insistent. He wanted it to have a power and this primitive thing without the Christian intervals, as he calls them. I also had orchestrated it for trombones and French horns. He thought the trombones were way too modern and had me take them out. And in fact, they were. I wrote that piece of music for the original funeral pyre, when Conan gives her the Viking launch, is the way John refers to it, when he's cremating her. Of course, we needed to recall
tráilers, visita mi
Valeria's
canal.
theme. It's based on the Conan Valeria love theme, which is in the original one as well. So that was really, I think, one of the few references to Valeria in The Destroyer. But I sped it up. I do remember that. I made it faster, because maybe memories go quicker than the actual occurrence of the event. The Hall of Mirrors is a real set piece, and I mean, both I think in the way it was designed for the film in terms of the production, the movement that goes through it, the fight that takes place within it, and the music itself. I mean, this is an example, I think, of the Conan being a little more sophisticated. It's completely interior. There's a modernity to it with the tricks of the mirrors, and it's the sort of thing that it just feels a little more sophisticated, a little more planned. It's a different kind of mind at work. So musically, I realized that I would have to represent that. There's more magic. There's kind of a sense of magic, a sense of discovery, a sense of deceit, because of all the mirrors. And in the end, of course, is a sense of Conan's power, because he ultimately wins over the adversity with which he's faced. Interestingly enough, that's one of the pieces I wrote first, because I knew that needed to be a completely different type of sound, type of orchestration, with the exception of the theme that surfaces at the end. In the Hall of Mirrors, it needed a particular kind of sound. I think something that would reflect, no pun intended, the kind of shimmering, sparkling images that Richard used in the film. And for that reason, I chose instruments like piccolo and harpsichord, and just things that musically would represent the kind of visual that goes along with it. It was, and again, it being interior has a whole different sound than if the thing had been shot out, say, in a plain or Stonehenge or something like that. So it had a whole, it was a place I knew I needed to work through this particular sequence of the movie, because it was so different from the previous film. Some composers like to write the most difficult sequences first, because they assume, or the longest ones, because they assume that it will be those sequences from which the material is mostly drawn from. It'll contain the most number of thematic ideas. I, on the other hand, usually skip the main title, because I figure the main title is almost like an overture, unless there's some specific kinds of action going on that needs to be cued. The main title usually comes, I'll write that last, generally. And then try to follow the arc of the film as best I can with the music. I'll know what the main themes are, the representations of the characters or the situations, or even sometimes, as in the case of Starship Troopers, the environments became major thematic motifs for me. I would prefer to do it linear. Oftentimes when we get into chasing a dub, which means basically the composer's still working while the film itself is being blended with the elements of the dialogue, sound effects, and music are being blended on in another stage, we're still writing. Or there might be changes. There are ubiquitous picture changes. So composers generally are working alongside the rest of the schedule. When they're dubbing, generally prefer to dub in sequence, so therefore that requires that the music is recorded in sequence to keep feeding the dub stage the latest music that's coming out. And I think what we were going for was really more of a continuation of the first Conan, which was enhance what's on the screen, but also try to create a sense of a reality of it rather than an abstraction of it. It's a little more than see a monkey, hear a monkey, but hopefully it's more than that. But the main thing was to create this world and stay consistent within it.